Okay, to get started on your checkerboard block, I should call it a checkerboard triangle because it is a triangle shaped block. Here's a picture of it finished. And some of the things you will need are, you're going to need a hoop scissors, you're going to need thread for piecing and quilting, along with a matching bobbin. You will need embroidery bobbin thread, Vanish light water soluble thread. You'll need to cut your backing fabric, an optional piece of wool that's been prepped on all three sides of your triangle shape, and you will need to have strip pieced section of fabric that you've made. You're going to have, for the large block, you're going to have, these are all going to be 2 inches. This one here on the left, the light one, is going to be a 2.5 inch piece of fabric. To get more information on the size for the small blocks, you can refer to your fabric and thread key and your first page of your instructions. You're also going to need, for the large, a 2.5 by 3 inch piece of your dark fabric. So we have already hooped our battleizer, so let's go to the machine and we will begin stitching out our checkerboard block. I'm all set up for step 1, and I have my battleizer hooped. I have water soluble thread in the needle and embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and we're going to stitch the placement stitch. Step 2, I'm going to continue with the water soluble thread in the needle, and I have my wool that I prepared and cut the correct size and pressed along the edges. So we're just going to put that right inside of that placement stitch, and the machine will sew a zigzag stitch to tack that to the battleizer. For step 3, we're going to continue with the water soluble thread, and we're going to stitch a pattern right onto the wool. And since the wool is a little bit loftier than just something like a flat piece of fabric or the batting, you may want to, just ahead of where it's stitching, make sure the wool is pushed down. Another thing that you can do that's very helpful is if your machine has the capability of raising your presser foot, you can go into the settings on your machine and make that change as well. So just a couple tips to help you get that pattern onto the wool without any issues. Step 4, we're going to tack down our strip set that we previously made, and we're still using our water soluble thread. You're going to want to align the seams right here along with the pattern that was stitched out onto your wool or onto your battleizer. So you're just going to line those up, but you also, on this horizontal line, you're going to want it to go 1/4 inch past that. And of course that's your 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you can just flip it back and make sure everything's lined up really well, and it looks good. I'm going to go ahead and lay it down. If you go a little bit more than 1/4 inch past the horizontal line, that is certainly not a problem. And I'm going to attach my hoop. And I think I moved my fabric, so I'm just going to do another quick peek. And with the water soluble thread, I'm going to stitch over the first seam. And if you want to stop your machine at that point and then double check to make sure your seams are aligned for the next section, you can go ahead and do that too. Or if you're confident, just keep on sewing. It's just a little added insurance policy. Okay, and then we'll continue to do that tack down stitch around the Okay, step 5. What you're going to need to do before step 5 is you can cut using your hoop scissors this fabric, the bulk of your strip set off, leaving it anywhere from 1/4 to 1/2 inch outside the block. And since the next step is a seam, you're going to want to change your water-soluble thread to I've used the quilting thread that I'm going to be using, my polyester embroidery thread, or you could use just a regular sewing thread because we're doing a seam. And then you're going to take your strip set, you're going to flip it upside down so it's right sides together. And if you notice, this is how we lined up the first section. This next section, since it is a checkerboard, we're going to have to shift. So we're going to shift to the right to achieve our checkerboard look. So then we're going to lay this down. Since we already have cut this 1/4 inch, we can just align the raw edges of our strip set along with the top of that section. And since you have your seams all pressed to the dark side, they'll nicely lock right in there. So you can just lay that down. You can actually feel it lock. You can do a little peek if you want to make sure it's where it needs to be. And then you'll do the same thing with each of those intersections. So we're going to begin sewing the seam. And I have my finger on the start-stop button just so I can do another check and adjustment if I need to. So now that I've sewn across this intersection, I'll check the next intersection. Make sure I don't need to do any adjustments, and make them if you need to. And then the final one, it looks perfect. Okay, so there's our first seam. Let's see how it looks. I'm going to flip this up, and I can see my intersections. They look pretty good. So now we're flipping it up. We're going to finger press it, and we're going to do a tack down stitch. What I want you to be careful to do is you want to make sure that where these seams are, that when you do your tack down, it's going to land in the right place. So we're not just going to blindly hit start and do that. You're going to take your strip set, and you're still going to have it flipped up, but you're going to also bring this part back, and you're going to find the next horizontal line, and you just lay the fabric right there, and we're just going to give it a finger press, and that will give us a marking to know where to cut it. And then we're going to lift up the fabric. We're going to cut it 1/4 inch above. Probably can't see it. Let me cut it 1/4 inch above where we have just finger pressed. So I'm using my hoop scissors. You probably can't see that. But I've cut my strip set, and now I'm going to lay it down. And you're going to make sure that, again, the seams of your strip set are going to match the pattern that we stitched out in step 3. So it looks good. Let me attach the hoop. And we're still using our embroidery thread or regular sewing thread, not our water soluble. We don't need to switch back and forth at this point. So now it's just going to sew a tack down stitch. Flip this thread. Okay, and now we're going to do the next seam. And so again, this is where we had it last time, and they all align, but we want to shift it a little bit so that we get our checkerboard effect. Last time we shifted to the right. This time we're going to shift to the left, and we're going to make sure everything lines up and we get that checkerboard effect. And we're going to make sure that we have this seam lined up with that, and then we're going to sew our seam. Whoop. You see how that happened and the seam kind of flipped over? It's okay. It's really not a big deal. We're just going to continue on. And I'm going to make sure that this seam is matching up appropriately. Okay, so now I can flip my fabric right side up and my seams look great where they're matching. I'm going to finger press my seam real good. And then I'm going to bring this fabric back up and find where the next horizontal line is, where the next seam will stitch. And then I'm going to finger press there, and actually all across my entire strip set, and that way when I fold it open, where that fold mark is, that tells me that I can trim it with my hoop scissors 1/4 of an inch above that. So let me do that. I usually don't do it like this, I hold it differently, but in order for you to see what I'm doing, and the camera almost cut my sleeve. Okay, so now I can make sure I'm finger pressed really good. I'm going to make sure my seams are all lined up and they look good, and now I'm going to sew a tack down stitch, still using my embroidery thread or my sewing thread. Okay, now I can take my final piece of fabric, which is going to be the dark fabric at the tip, and I'm going to lay it the long side along the seam. So right side's down, put my raw edges even, and I'm going to sew a seam. Okay, the next step for our block is we're going to add our backing fabric since we have our last piece of fabric stitched on there. So I'm going to turn my hoop over, and hopefully everyone can see. I'm going to add my backing fabric. Let me adjust this camera a little bit. So here's my hoop, and I have sprayed the back side of my fabric with a little bit of the Sulky KK2000, and then you're just going to center that triangle over the rest of the block, and I always peek underneath to make sure I have the same amount of fabric in the seam allowances. Very gently adhere that to the back of the battleizer, and we're going to flip it over and put it under the machine. I always also, let me adjust the camera again so you can see, you're going to want to also peek underneath just to make sure that that little triangle stayed in place exactly where you want it. I have also changed my needle thread to water soluble because we don't want to be able to have any threads peeking out along the edge of their block when you sew your quilt together. You're going to flip that last piece of fabric you added, and you're going to finger press it, and with the water soluble thread we'll sew a tack down that holds the backing fabric on and also stitches around the perimeter of the block so we can see where the block is on the front. And I also wanted to show you that when you get to this side and you have fabric here that's going to little folds that may possibly get caught, grab your stylus and then just hold it down as the embroidery foot goes over it. Okay, the final step in this block is the quilting, and I'm just going to peek under, make sure that my little triangle, the backing fabric, is exactly where it needs to be. This would be a good place to turn your automatic thread cutter off. And also what you're going to do is you're going to bring your bobbin thread to the top. And your bobbin thread at this point, after the backing fabric is added on, you're going to match your bobbin thread to your needle thread. The reason we do those two things is so that the backing doesn't have any little bird nests or anything as it's stitching and cutting the thread in that. Just helps for a better looking back. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the start button, and then machine will do some quilting for us. I'm just going to to stop the machine and trim that thread tail. Here's our completed checkerboard block. Now to trim this, you're going to trim a 1/2 inch away from the outside basting stitch that holds the back on. And we're going to do this because our sashing, we're going to join this together with sashing on the front and the back. So I'm going to turn the ruler side of my trimmer by George. I almost put it on a 1/4 inch. I'm going to put my 1/2 inch mark right on the basting stitch, and I'm going to trim through all the layers. This is some Riley Blake fabric, and it's just so pretty. So 1/2 inch on all 3 sides through all layers, and that's how you will trim all the triangle blocks in this year's mystery quilt.